Is Rick Warren doing okay? He hasn't been the same since April 5, 2013, when he experienced the most devastating catastrophe of his life, and it now appears that his situation may worsen. This is the tale of how a family's tragedy turned into a crusade, and how sadness never truly goes away, no matter how strong your faith. This is the aspect of Rick Warren that most people find most confusing. The world had already witnessed him break on national television before his unending agony finally broke him. Rick had already experienced the agony of being publicly torn apart. Rick's name became a lightning rod back in 2006 when Saddleback was growing rapidly. He became well known due to his growth, but it also made him a target. Many churches disagreed with the purpose-driven growth paradigm that Rick outlined. However, even he was unable to foresee what would happen next. Because they attempted to adopt his tactics, congregations all over America broke apart. Arguments over worship styles and seating arrangements are causing churches to split, members to be expelled, and friendships to terminate in parking lots. Rick detested that. He pleaded with pastors not to approach development like a battle, to evict people, or to impose anything. However, the harm still occurred. Additionally, Rick felt accountable each time a church used his playbook to tear itself apart. Imagine living with the knowledge that something you made caused hundreds of people to perish and thousands to flourish. Then he became worse. Rick entered an unexpected storm in 2008. Barack Obama requested him to say the inauguration prayer after he was elected. It ought to have been a privilege. Rather, it turned into a national scandal. People discovered a letter he had written to his own congregation expressing his own conviction that a man and a woman should only be married in accordance with the Bible. The consequences weren't pleasant either. Once a best-selling pastor, Rick Warren is now the target of hate speech accusations, headlines, protests, and calls to be removed from the inauguration. The irony. He told reporters that he made genuine friendships in the LGBTQ community 6 months prior while embracing HIV patients and assisting homosexual men and women in his church's AIDS outreach. However, none of that was important. America desired a villain. Obama spoke up for him, claiming that disagreement was not hate and that Rick had embraced him at Saddleback despite their differences. Still, the outcry was fierce. The most bizarre aspect was that while some requested an apology, many other Christians started criticizing him for the opposite reason. They claimed that he lacked sufficient anger, militancy, and harshness. As he observed them, Rick pondered how battling individuals could possibly get them nearer to Jesus. He lost someone, regardless of what he said. Someone always called him a coward, regardless of what he did. That was not the end of it. Accusations kept coming in. Rick was chastised by evangelical pastors in 2009 and 2012 for having dinner with Muslims, dining with imams, and attending interfaith conferences on poverty, world suffering, and peace. He talked about how Jesus was a friend to everyone. However, that straightforward notion of friendship sparked yet another round of indignation, concessions, dishonesty, and treachery. The words were hurled at him like stones. Every time Rick attempted to construct a bridge, he was accused of setting one on fire. But he was accustomed to criticism, to controversy, to waking up to find that strangers had determined his character. However, nothing could have prepared him for the subsequent suffering. When Matthew Warren was diagnosed, he was 7 years old. According to the experts, Rick and Kay had clinical depression. Warren was unable to fully comprehend it. They witnessed it, But how can a youngster who is hardly old enough to tie his own shoes bear that type of darkness? From the very beginning, when Matthew was only a child, there were indications. There was a problem. The world felt heavier, sharper, and crueler than it should have because of something in the wiring of his lovely, brilliant intellect. He was the type of child who could spot the person in pain the moment he entered a room, perhaps because he understood other people's suffering, the same agony that inhabited him each day. At events, friends recall Matthew going straight for anyone who appeared uneasy or disoriented in a crowd. He was gifted with a sense of human pain. Doesn't the irony pierce deeply? On his own, the youngster who sensed the darkness of everyone else was drowning. Later, Rick Warren would characterize his son as a young man with a sharp mind and a kind heart that comforted countless people. He was also extremely kind, sensitive, and empathetic. However, that is the public persona that Matthew presented to the world. The Warren family was leading a separate life behind closed doors, endless doctor's appointments, drugs that didn't work despite promising relief, sessions of therapy that resembled tossing stones into the sea, observing their son battle severe depressions that engulfed him year after year, sudden panic attacks. His demeanor was completely transformed by mood swings. They made every effort. The best doctors in America, Rick said, the most cutting-edge therapies, therapists, and prayers from thousands of individuals worldwide who were unaware of Matthew's name. Warren kept his sickness a secret, not because he was ashamed, but rather because he needed to preserve his dignity and share his tale. When your own kid asks you why he can't simply die, how do you respond to your mega-church congregation and the millions of others who read your books? Because Matthew asked his father that question. Sitting across from Rick when he was 17, the child gave him a glance and uttered something that would follow the pastor for the rest of his life. He informed his father that it was brutally clear that he would not be cured. They had seen some of the country's top physicians. The best medication had been taken by him. They had tried every strategy imaginable, but nothing had worked. Thus, Matthew posed the issue to his father that no parent should ever have to deal with. Why can't I simply pass away and enter paradise? Rick told him that he had to persevere. As a father, he had to think that there might be a solution out there. They had not yet tried some of the treatments. There will soon be a breakthrough. After that chat, Matthew made it another 10 years. For 10 years, he tried, hoped, and woke up each morning with the same unrelenting ache that was like barbed wire around his brain. However, this is what Rick Warren instinctively knew. He sensed something terrible was coming, even though he couldn't express it out. Identify it as intuition. Call it a phobia of fathers. Call it what you wish. He was aware that Matthew's suffering would eventually become intolerable, and that information weighed down and chilled him like a stone in his chest. Each and every day, the Warren family enjoyed a great time together on April 5. It's really awful because of it. They laughed, chatted, and spent time together as a family. Everything appeared to be all right. Matthew appeared to be doing well. Depression, however, lies. It informs you that there is no hope, no relief, and no way out. And Matthew returned home to his Mission Viejo house in what Rick would later describe as a brief wave of melancholy. Approximately 10:00 a.m., he made a choice that would tear his family apart that Friday morning. He shot himself. It was an afternoon call. After suffering a self-inflicted gunshot wound, Matthew was discovered dead in his house. The serial number of the unregistered firearm, which he had unlawfully purchased online, was rubbed out. Matthew had managed to get around California's gun registration laws and background check requirements. Afterwards, Rick would tweet that he had forgiven the individual who had sold his son the pistol, citing Matthew 6:15 about forgiving others in order to receive God's forgiveness. However, there was no theology, no forgiveness, and no purpose that Friday. Simply a father who needed to identify the body of his son. Rick and Kay's tiny group showed up half an hour after they received the news. They didn't wait for approval, call, or SMS. They simply appeared on the pavement, encircled the Warren with their arms, and remained motionless. Rick would later observe, "You need fewer words, the deeper the pain." His tiny company slept on kitchen sofas that night, wherever there was room in the Warren house. "We're not leaving you alone." They didn't. Rick wrote to his Saddleback Church congregation the following day. He told them the truth. After 33 years of serving as their pastor, attending their funerals, and supporting them at every possible crisis. The agonized agony we are experiencing at the moment is beyond words, he added. He described Matthew's kindness, compassion, and brilliant mind. But he also said what needed to be said, that even with America's best doctors, best medications, and best prayers, the torture of mental illness never went away. The media exploded as our youngest son, Matthew 27, passed away today. Matthew had been a lifelong member of Saddleback. Some people couldn't help but criticize Rick Warren, the purpose-driven pastor, for losing his son to suicide. How could the man who helped millions of people find meaning in their lives fail to save his own child? Some questioned his faith, while others suggested this was God's judgment. Rick mostly ignored the criticism. However, the burden of public grief differs from that of private mourning. Everyone wanted a piece of Rick's suffering, wanted to comprehend it, analyze it, and use it to prove whatever point they needed to prove. However, Rick had other worries, such as organizing a funeral that was impossible because there was no building in Orange County big enough to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. In order to honor Matthew's memory, the Warren family decided to hold a private memorial for just family members. They asked people to donate to the Matthew Warren Fund for Mental Health instead, and thousands of checks began to come in. Rick refrained from preaching for 4 months, or 16 weeks of deliberate silence. He moved away from the pulpit at Saddleback, let other pastors fill in, and spent his days by himself with Kay and God. When Rick finally returned in late July and stood in front of his congregation for the first time since Matthew's death, he was different. He no longer just sympathized, he now felt people's pain more deeply. Rick claimed that spending that much time in serious conversation with the Almighty changes you. The sermon that day, which had been chosen weeks before Matthew's suicide, a cosmic coincidence that felt almost cruel, was about getting through what you're going through. And Rick spoke about grief as God's gift, the way we transition through loss. He could relate because he now understood what it was like to bury your child. As he sobbed on stage, Kay stood next to him and dabbed at his cheek, telling the audience that Matthew's body was broken, that the gun had broken it, but that he would be raised in glory. She talked about how she missed him and how her heart was crushed until Jesus came to get her. Her words, "It's okay to walk through life with tears in your eyes and a smile on your face at the same time," stopped people cold. That sermon set off a larger mental health initiative at Saddleback Church, which included conferences, workshops, and support groups. Rick collaborated with the Catholic Diocese of Orange, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, psychiatrists, counselors, and anyone who would listen. He began posing the necessary question. There's no shame when your heart fails. No shame when your kidneys stop working. So why do we feel shame when our brains break down? He spoke candidly about Matthew at this point, calling him one of the bravest people he had ever met because he continued to live for 10 more years after questioning why he couldn't just die. His motto, his method of making sense of the incomprehensible, was that Matthew's life had meaning even in its brokenness, perhaps especially in its brokenness. Rick read thousands of letters from people Matthew had led to faith in Christ, and he wrote in his journal that even broken trees bear fruit in God's garden of grace. And Rick forgave not only the gun dealer, but life itself. He never doubted his belief in God, but months later, he said on CNN that he had doubts about God's plan. He acknowledged that God was good, but he clarified that not everything that occurs is God's will, because we live in a world where people have free will. Rick repeatedly referred to Matthew as brave in interviews, sermons, and private conversations with friends. Rick could not hold God responsible for Matthew's decision to end his own life. Instead, he had to accept it, find a way to live with it, and figure out how to continue breathing when every instinct told him to stop. This is what people didn't see. Maybe Rick was right. Maybe endurance in the face of that kind of suffering is the truest form of courage. Brave for trying one more medication, one more therapy session, one more day when everything in him screamed to quit. Brave for getting up every morning despite the constant pain. You don't get over losing a child, you just get through it. You may learn to carry it, but it's always there. That grief sitting in your chest like a second heart. Rick told people that he cried every single day after Matthew died. How could he have moved past it? Depression became a part of his preaching, woven into sermons, devotionals, and interviews, and he spoke about it in 2024 while still working with California's Catholic bishops on a pastoral letter called Hope and Healing. He saw it as a turning point, a new benchmark for mental health ministries globally, and he didn't see that as weakness. In 2025, Rick continued to preach, travel the world, speak at the World Evangelical Alliance in Seoul, South Korea, teach at Saddleback, and record his daily hope devotionals. His sermons, "Your chemistry is not your character. Your illness is not your identity," sounded like an incantation that, if repeated enough, might heal someone else's son or daughter. In the quiet moments between sermons, conferences, and traveling the world, Rick Warren remained that father on a sidewalk in Mission Viejo. He spoke about faith, purpose, and finding meaning in suffering. He established foundations for mental health, AIDS patients, and completing the Great Commission. He and Kay lived on 9% of their income and donated 91%. They now have 5 grandchildren. Rick Warren is still grieving. Years later, more than 10 years later, the loss hasn't lessened. This is the heartbreaking news that most people don't discuss. He is still the man who couldn't save his son. He still carries that conversation from when Matthew was 17. That question about why he couldn't just die. The pain hadn't gone away. It had just become part of who he was. Rick found the strength to be there for others, to hold their hands at gravesides, to tell them about God's garden of grace, where even broken trees grow fruit. But his tree is still broken and always will be. Not all wounds are healed by time. Some simply become scars you learn to live with. It's the awful paradox of pastoral ministry. You give and give and give until there's nothing left, and then you give some more because people need you. Because the work matters. He helps millions find their purpose while questioning God's plan. He preaches about hope but carries despair, because to stop would be to acknowledge that perhaps, just possibly, there is no meaning in some types of suffering. Rick Warren tells people that his faith did not break. He never questioned God's existence, never doubted heaven, and he never stopped believing in the resurrection. Rick knows deep down that although Matthew's body was broken, he is now in glory. The belief that he will one day see his son again, whole and healed and free from the agony that tormented him for 27 years, is what keeps Rick going. Without it, Matthew's death would have been a senseless tragedy, random suffering in a universe that doesn't care. However, the question remains, is Rick Warren really okay? He claims to be different now, changed, and more sympathetic. The polished mega-church pastor who wrote best-selling books has given way to something raw and more human. Perhaps this is growth, perhaps it's grace, or perhaps it's just what happens when the worst thing imaginable becomes your reality. He feels people's pain in a way he never did before Matthew's death. He weeps easily. He connects with the broken and hurting because he is broken and hurting. Every Monday morning, Rick confesses, he wakes up with what he calls post-message syndrome, wondering if someone else could do a better job, wondering if he's smart enough, strong enough, and faithful enough to lead a church of tens of thousands. Despite this, Rick continues to work, preach to thousands every week, travel the world, spread the gospel, and build his empire of churches, foundations, and initiatives. Rick tells people that God never puts more on you than he puts in you to bear it, and that people should help each other carry each other's burdens. But what happens when your burden becomes too heavy to bear? What happens when faith, medicine, prayer, and everything else you try still isn't enough? Rick doesn't have those answers. Nobody does. The doubt creeps in, the exhaustion, the weight of carrying everyone else's burdens while barely managing his own. He only has the option to continue or to stop, and he decides to continue. However, the cracks are evident in sermons where he must pause and gather himself, in tweets that reveal more suffering than solace, and in interviews where he chokes up in the middle of a sentence. Kay stands next to him, wiping away his tears while bearing her own broken heart. The story doesn't have a tidy conclusion, no redemption arc where everything makes sense, no moment where Rick finds peace and the pain goes away. It's just a man who lost his son, who doubts God's plan while holding fast to God's goodness, who preaches hope while living with heartbreak. They're not the same people they were before April 5th, 2013. How could they be? Is Rick Warren okay? He's just a father who forgave the person who sold his son a gun, because forgiveness is what you're meant to do, even when it seems impossible.